Alright everyone, it's linguistics time, something that I like talking about because I took linguistic anthropology once and got hooked on the basic premise of human understanding through language. Here's an easy linguistic argument that you can make against gun regulation. Probably should have made this video a long time ago, although in the wake of Bruin a lot of the anti-gun laws are beginning to recede anyway. Sort of like McDonald versus Chicago all over again. It's funny how that decision was never rendered illegitimate by an illegitimate court because Orange Man Bad wasn't a thing at the time. Subjugate terms matter within language. You can think of, if you want to visualize this, just think of Venn diagrams. It's probably the easiest way to do so. So imagine that I tell you something regarding Americans. Who am I referring to with Americans? People from America. Now, it can be the more expansive term, people from the North or South American continents. If you're from the United States, you're probably referring to U.S. citizens. That is Americans. Maybe Canadians, honorary Americans. That's a large pool of people, 400 million people. Now let's say I use the term Asian Americans. I'm not referring to every person within the U.S., certainly not within the continent. I'm referring to people either within the continent or within the United States, the confines therein civically, who happen to be of broadly Asian origin. And the term may differ, someone's half Japanese and half Irish or something like that. But I'm regarding a much smaller pool of people now. It is subjugate to the concept of Americans. Effectively have hyphenated the term. When we talk about well-regulated in the terms of the Second Amendment, which is the big sticking point for a lot of people, they think that it means government regulation. The problem is that government regulation is a subjugate term. They're focusing on the minor term as opposed to the broad overarching term. So much like Americans includes a lot of groups that aren't Asian Americans, regulation includes a lot of things that are not government regulation. The original meaning of the term, if you look in the 1700s parlance, and it was in common use at the time, is to make something well-ordered. Government regulation is a small subjugate to that, and certainly not the intent of the founders if you understand U.S. civics. Government regulation is when the government attempts to make something well-ordered. More often than not, it fails at this, by the way. It's probably the least efficient regulatory system that you can use when you have a big bureaucracy. You can also regulate things yourself. For instance, you can regulate your diet. You can regulate your watch. You're making sure that it's tuned to the right time effectively. Business regulations. Business may regulate itself, not through government or state power, simply have a regulatory capability in and of itself. Machines can be regulated, and in the original use of the term, the most common usage would have been mechanics. You're regulating a machine. I've regulated my printing press. I'm making sure the typeset is perfectly straight. I'm making sure it's oiled up. I've tested it out. I make sure that it can press the ink into the pages and there's not going to be a bunch of problems with typos and stuff. I've well regulated my printing press. This would have been an actual usage at the time. The fact is that people who have a stick up their ass about gun ownership typically refer to it in the common parlance as government regulation. That's because the colloquial usage of regulation typically no longer applies to mechanics. You might say well-ordered, but you wouldn't go into the car dealership and say, hey, I want you to regulate my vehicle. But the problem is that the Constitution was not written yesterday. It was written in the 1700s. In that time period, most often you're talking about mechanics or you're talking about personal behavior, a regulated diet, etc., etc. There are examples of this on, I think it was constitution.org. This is probably the best way to explain to people why gun regulation, in the sense of a government making a law, is unacceptable under the Second Amendment. Because you can draw a comparison that would be more contemporary that they would understand. Again, American versus subjugate American groups. You would say, there are a million examples of this. For instance, computers. Okay, is it a laptop? Is it a desktop computer? All of these are different forms of computer. If I write something prior to the development of tablets, and I'm talking about computing systems, I'm clearly not talking about tablets now, am I? In this period, government regulation was a small outside subjugate. It was not the general colloquial usage of that particular term. Generally, again, it was personal regulation, your behavior, your diet, etc., or it was mechanical in nature. It was a machine that you were talking about. This is probably the easiest way to drive it home to people who have a natural proclivity towards not liking the idea of personal gun ownership because they simply do not understand the Second Amendment's wording. Of course, the second part of the Second Amendment that makes it clear that it applies to the people broadly is usually ignored entirely. The term militia, of course, in its original context, it's literally everyone other than those that are doing soldiering. It explicitly doesn't involve the U.S. military in the original usage. In fact, there was no military for it to actually apply to at the time, and the idea of disarming a military wouldn't make any sense whatsoever, so it's a complete non-starter. The well-regulated part, though, is used as a broad sort of contextual clue by liberals to justify any and all gun laws that may exist. I would also point out, of course, that under Bruin, all previous decisions should be weighed on historical merit. But there is no historical merit to any gun control in the U.S. prior to Cruikshank. Almost 100 years we went without any anti-gunnery, and for some reason, people were just fine. The country experienced some of the most massive growth in the world at the time and was becoming well-regulated in the process. That's about all. Peace out.